Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to take a moment to welcome you to the widely attended gatherings massively open online course. For those of you who may have joined us from OGE's homepage, welcome, and we hope that you find today's presentation to be both informative and thought-provoking. Also, feel free to click around and see what else that we've got on our Google Plus page and on our YouTube page. Before I turn it over to my fellow lead instructors, Mr. Patrick Shepard and Mrs. Cheryl Kane-Piasecki, I have a few announcements. The first one is that the second half of this course is going to take place on Thursday, August 7th at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this is going to be the debrief of the exercises that you're going to be presented with today. On Thursday, August 14th, we have a Gifts from Outside Sources Fundamentals series presentation, always a very popular one. On Thursday, August 21st, we're going to do a presentation on widely attended gatherings versus 1353 regulations. And on Thursday, August 28th, we are going to be doing two summit preview sessions. One of them is going to be for in-person attendees, and the other one is going to be for all of our virtual attendees. So for those of you who are planning to attend our summit in a virtual fashion, this will be a really good introduction to all of the different things that we're going to be able to offer to you for that time. And so with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Patrick Shepard and Cheryl Kane-Piasecki.
Thanks, Ryan. It's really good to be here. It's good to be here with you, Cheryl.
Yes, and likewise, Patrick.
So today we're going to be talking about the widely attended gatherings, yes?
Yes. It's probably one of the more complex gifts analysis that ethics officials have to do, and I can say, at least in the Washington, D.C. area, it's probably one of the most frequently used exceptions of the gift exceptions. And so I know we've got people tuning in from outside the D.C. area, and I'm hoping that what we're going to be talking about and what the exercises we're going to have you do over the next couple of days, that you're going to find them useful as well. But I will sort of caveat what we're going to do here for this MOOC to say we are sort of relating to some DC-based type of experiential learning here.
So this is maybe, we might get into some concepts that are less familiar to folks who are maybe listening from the field. They may not have heard of these events, but the process is generally the same, right?
Exactly, and I think that's one of the things we're going to spend a good deal of time today talking to you about, which is we've created sort of an analytical process for you to follow, because for those of you who do have experience doing widely attended gathering determinations, there are various moving parts in a WAG determination, and there are lots of different elements that have to be present in order to be able to use the WAG exception. And so you're right, Patrick. I mean, I think that some of the examples that we're going to be using may or may not resonate completely with folks in the field, but certainly the same analytical process you will use for the types of events that you encounter in the regions.
Okay. So what's the plan for this week? I know we have two sessions. What are we going to be knocking out today, and then what are we going to be talking about when we get back together on Thursday? Okay.
Well, today what we want to do is we want to familiarize you with the process, and really, so what we're going to be doing is sort of force marching you through. There's a WAG worksheet that we gave you among the materials that were provided on the MAX site. So actually, why don't we take a minute to make sure that everybody has their ducks in a row here, and make sure we're going to have a copy of the slide deck that we're going to be posting, and you're going to be able to see that on the Google Hangout.
During our talk today.
For those of you who are on the phone line, just if you can make sure you have a copy of the slide presentation available as we walk through it, we'll try to make sure that you're on the same page, literally, that we are. And then you should have a WAG analysis worksheet. That's what we're going to be walking you through today, so that you're familiar with the worksheet itself. You should have a copy of, what should they definitely have a copy of, Patrick, that we always expect people to have a copy of?
You should have a copy of your employee standards of conduct, because we prefer not to practice from memory, but when advising employees, actually read the laws and regulations. I have mine.
It's blasphemy, Patrick. It's blasphemy. Yes, and I have mine as well. Yes, we're good little boys and girls here today. No, but please do have available a copy of whatever version of 2635 subpart B that you have, because part of this exercise today is going to be sort of directing your eyes to where in the regulation you're going to find definitions and you're going to find information about the various elements we're going to walk you through.
If folks don't have a copy, we did provide a link on the MAX page to subpart B of the standards, and anyone who joined us through the main website, while you're not registered and may not have access to that page, you can find information about subpart B in the regulations tab of the OGE website.
Mm-hmm. And we've given you a legal advisory that we issued on widely attended gatherings. It is a multi-page document. I think it's like 15 pages long.
It's very useful, though.
It is extremely useful, and it gives you some additional insight as to sort of interpretive guidance that we've brought to various of the concepts in the widely attended gathering exception. So I'm going to make, and Patrick and I are going to make some references to it today, but one thing I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you do is before you start the exercises, or at the very least while you're engaged in doing the exercises over the next 2 days, really make sure you're making use of that reference document to inform your understanding of how you're going to interpret various parts of it.
I think of the OG legal advisories, this is one of the top 3 or 4 that I keep printed out and on my desk because it comes up all the time. There's a lot of clear guidance, clear answers about items that do in fact come up for us as ethics officials every day. This is one of our more practical pieces of guidance, and I think you'll find it to be really useful. If you get nothing else out of this class except for the widely attended gathering analysis worksheet and the knowledge that this opinion exists, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. And the nice thing with that opinion as well is that it just introduces you to a little bit of the thinking that is behind the exception that may not be expressly stated in the regulation itself.
Yeah, and I think that's enormously helpful.
Extremely, extremely. And then we've given you 2 actual invitations that we're going to be using as the basis of our exercises.
Yeah, and our goal here isn't necessarily to come to a conclusion whether or not, for a given agency that an employee should be allowed to go to these events, but to go through the analysis process so we can determine what kinds of decisions we would need to make as ethics officials doing this piece of advice and counseling.
Yeah, and just to make sure that we don't miss any elements, because as I said, there are many pieces that have to be present in order for you to be able to use this exception. So we just want to make sure that you're not missing a piece when you're doing your analysis. And this sort of, like I said, kind of force marches you through an analytical process to make sure you cover all of those bases.
Yeah. I find with these, the hardest part is making sure that my analysis is complete. And I think as we go through over the next couple of days, couple of days.
It will feel, we'll try to make it not feel like a couple of years, let's put it that way.
Over the next couple of days, we're going to be talking about some tips and tricks you can use to make sure that your analysis is in fact complete.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Ryan, if you can pull up the next slide that we have, which is a gift analysis process.
This is also not a bad takeaway if you're not familiar with this particular diagram, if you're new to the gifts process.
Exactly. One thing we like to remind folks, Patrick, right, again and again and again, is that don't shortchange your analysis process. I think we all get very comfortable thinking we know the regulations, thinking we know how these things work, and we wind up taking shortcuts, and by doing so, we can actually make our lives a lot more complicated and make ourselves do more work than is absolutely necessary. Would you agree?
That's absolutely true, and I don't know how many times I've talked to an agency ethics official, for example, and they're struggling with a potential gifts problem. We get around to talking about their strategy, and they say, well, you have considered using, say, your agency's gift acceptance authority. And I say, oh.
Yeah.
I think that's an important thing is to have a completeness to your analysis and not shortchange it. You don't have to start with the exception. You can work through the whole process.
Exactly. Now, even for purposes of just the standards of conduct, I think we need to always make sure that we're we're following a process to make sure that we're answering the question that needs to be answered. So when you're dealing just with the standards of conduct, the process is this. It is you start out with the question of, okay, is the thing that's being offered, is it considered to be a gift? Because as you're all aware, or you should remember from the gift analysis process, and in fact, why don't we get in the regulation and take a quick look, if you've got Subpart B in front of you, is to take a look at 2635. And we're looking at 2635.203. And if you look at 203B, we have what is the definition of a gift. And a gift includes a whole ton of stuff, any gratuity, favor, discount, entertainment, hospitality, loan, forbearance, or other item having monetary value. So it's a whole universe of things that could ostensibly be a gift, right?
That's pretty much all of the things.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of that, everything in the kitchen sink,
it's
really.
pretty inclusive, the general definition there.
And that, but then what does it go on to do peculiarly?
Well, then we carve out a number of things. We include them in the definition only for the purposes of then excluding them from the definition. So what are these? These are the things that aren't gifts, right?
Exactly.
So what are some of the more common ones that we use here?
The first one, which is modest items of food and refreshments, such as soft drinks, coffee, and donuts. I mean, that's a very common one, I think, that people find all the time.
Yeah, that's very helpful. You know, if you're on site for a meeting with someone who does business with your agency, you can have a cup of coffee. That's okay. You can have a glass of water.
Exactly.
So I think that's, you know, pretty straightforward. People understand that pretty regularly.
Other ones are things like greeting cards and what we call items with little intrinsic value. So things that are offered just sort of as a commemoration of your having provided, for example, a speech, like a plaque or a trophy or a certificate of having participated in an event. Those kinds of things are common, I think, as well.
I think that's a fairly normal thing. You speak at a conference, and you know, maybe you're presented with you know, a small plaque or a display item that thanks you for your participation. I think that's pretty reasonable and easy to understand.
Any others that come to mind for you, Patrick, that sort of jump off the page at you there?
The only one that I also sometimes forget, but it's important to remember, is that we exclude any gifts accepted by the government under specific statutory authority. And I think this is particularly relevant when we're talking about widely attended gatherings. There are a whole number of other authorities that the government can use, and in some cases must use, when it is offered a gift. And this is important when we talk about WAGs, because you know, while WAGs are gifts to the employees accepting them personally, we do have this element of agency interest. There are other authorities, though, right, that agencies can use, like we have 31 U.S.C. 1353 for gifts of travel. And that's not discretionary, right? We have to use 1353 if the government's going to accept travel payments.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that we're gonna touch on this in a little bit more explicitly when we get into the WAG worksheet that we're going to walk you through. But again, I think this is part of the gift analysis that people kind of shortchange sometimes, which is just because your employee's been invited to something that kind of looks like something you think could be interpreted as a WAG doesn't mean that it's necessarily the right authority to use to allow the employee to accept the thing that's being offered. There are other authorities. Sometimes those other authorities have to be used in lieu of the WAG authority. But again, you just want to make sure that what's being offered is actually something that is appropriate to be accepted under the standards of conduct, and then by extension, that's appropriate to be accepted under the widely attended gathering exception. So your first point in your analysis is always going to be, is it a gift as that is defined in the standards of conduct, in subpart B of the standards of conduct? So what's the next question then they have to answer, Patrick?
So then we have to find out if it's a prohibited gift, because there are certainly things that are gifts that don't fall under the general prohibition.
Right. And where do we find that? Where do we find
the prohibition? Let's go backwards and take a look at the prohibition. And I find that at 2635-202A.
Okay.
And you know, this is our general prohibition. This is what we're really talking about. This is where the rubber hits the road. So except as provided in this subpart, an employee shall not directly or indirectly solicit or accept a gift. And then there are two prongs, and I think it's important to recognize that we need only satisfy one of them for the gift to be prohibited. So we may not accept gifts from prohibited sources, and we also may not accept gifts given because of an employee's official position. So this means any gift offered to an employee by any person, if it's motivated by the employee's official position, they may not accept that under the general prohibition unless an exception applies.
Exactly. And I think sometimes folks, again, I think are skip this. I mean, and inadvertently do so, but skip this process and they're they're 3/4 of the way through looking for an exception or trying to figure out how an exception fits, and then they say, "Oh, wow, wait a minute. Is this entity even a prohibited source? You know, is this a gift that has even been offered because of the employee's position?" So again, this is one of those things where don't shortchange this part of the analysis. Make sure that you're actually dealing with a gift that would otherwise be prohibited.
Yeah, so if we have an employee who, say, is invited to a family member's wedding and the family member is not a prohibited source, we don't need to do a WAG analysis. We'd have a whole number of other exceptions that might apply in that case. But don't put yourself through that unnecessarily.
Exactly. So then we come to the third part, which is once you've answered yes to the first two questions, which is it a gift, is it prohibited, that's when you then have to start looking for an exception. And the widely attended gathering exception is certainly one of those exceptions, but it is by no means the only exception, right, Patrick?
That's right. And, I think, at least in my experience, it should in some ways be an exception of last resort. It's, one of the higher bars to clear. And, if there are other exceptions that could apply or more clearly apply, it may be better to go there. Like I always sort of forget about G1. If you're speaking, you can attend on the day of an event. That's one that's very easy to use and requires a lot less in the way of analysis and gymnastics to figure out. So that's one place where I find it to be useful.
Exactly, and I think the other thing too is to understand that you don't necessarily have to rely exclusively on one exception. And you may find, in fact, that sometimes, depending upon what all is being offered in the context of an event, that you may have to use more than one exception if you want to get to yes with respect to whether or not people are able to accept the variety of things that they might actually be offered.
I think that's another really important point, is that also just because an exception could apply doesn't mean that it must be invoked or that the gift must be accepted. These are all discretionary, and in fact the regulation states that it's frequently prudent and often advisable not to accept a gift, notwithstanding the potential applicability of an exception. So just because an exception may apply doesn't mean that a gift must be accepted, and in fact there are many, many cases where it would be prudent not to accept a gift, notwithstanding the possible applicability of an exception. When we look at WAG, we find that analysis is explicit in the use of the exception, but it applies for all of them. There's no requirement to accept if an exception applies.
Yeah, and I think I can't underscore that enough, because I think that we want to make sure that the exceptions don't start eating the prohibition, which is to say that the general prohibition, the general proscription is you cannot accept a gift, period, from a prohibited source or given because of your official position. And exceptions exist to address what are exceptional circumstances. So I agree with Patrick. The fact that an exception exists doesn't mean that it's always prudent to allow the employee to avail themselves of the exception in order to accept a gift that might otherwise, really not be necessary for the employee.
Yeah, and I think this is reflected in the structure of the rule. I don't think there's always meaning in the order of things in the rule, but here I think there is clearly. We have the general prohibition at 202A. We have the relationship to 201, which is the criminal bribery statute. And then C, the very next portion. Before we get to definitions, exceptions, or anything, we have the limitation on use of exceptions. And that's very important. And don't forget that that's there, because that really sheds some light on the purpose of the rule and helps you in your analysis as an ethics official.
Exactly. So why don't we go ahead then and move from here into our next slide. Now, the next slide that we have it should show step one. It's labeled step one, gifts offered. Now, these slides are basically following the order of the widely attended gathering gift exception worksheet that we're going to be asking you to use to analyze the two invitations that we've given you. So what I'd like you all to do is, before we jump into the step one, is I want to make sure everybody has a copy of that worksheet in front of them, so that you can follow along with the worksheet to see how what we're explaining in the slides sort of corresponds with what you're going to see on those worksheets and what you're going to be asked to answer, analyze and answer on each page of the worksheet. So if everybody could get the worksheet in front of them. Okay. If you see on page 1 of the worksheet, this is step 1, which is what the first thing you need to look at is what type of gifts are being offered. And this first page kind of encapsulates and provides a process, which is very much what we just walked through, Patrick,
yes.
is what we just talked about.
Right. What is the gift? Is it prohibited? Do we have an exception to apply? So that's where we're going to start, is what's being offered. Does this thing qualify as a gift?
Exactly. And we want to know, is it a gift? And then we also want to know, what is the nature of what is being offered? Because with the widely attended gathering exception, that exception only allows the employee to accept a gift of free attendance. So you have to start with asking yourself, is what the employee is being offered a gift of free attendance as that is defined in 2635-204 G4?
And this is really important here, and I think people kind of get confused. There's something unusual about the structure of this regulation in that we have an exception that contains within itself its own definitions.
Exactly.
And that's a little bit unusual in my experience, and I've actually run into ethics officials who look at G4 and think G4 is an exception on its own. G4 is a definition for purposes of the exceptions at G1 and G2. I understand structurally that's a little bit complicated, but it's important to know that and not look at free attendance and say you can accept anything that qualifies as free attendance. That's certainly not the case.
Exactly. So Ryan, if you can forward to the next slide, this just gives you, this shows you the reference point that we're talking about here, the part of the regulation where you're going to look to find out what the definition of free attendance is. And if we can go to the next slide then, I mean, that's just to familiarize you with where it is. Kind of in a nutshell, free attendance is all of these things, which is a waiver of a fee to attend, food, refreshments, entertainment, materials, provided that those things are furnished to all attendees as an integral part of the event. What doesn't it include, Patrick? And these are pretty material because this is going to affect the second part of your analysis on this worksheet.
Yeah, so we don't include travel or lodging. You know, we have some agency gift acceptance authorities that may apply for travel and lodging, so you may find yourself doing a hybrid analysis. It also doesn't include the fun stuff, so, you know, entertainment collateral to the event. You know, so maybe you're going to a conference or other similar event, and then there's a concert or musical performance afterwards. If that's collateral to the event, that would not be included under WAG. And also meals not in a group setting with other attendees. So, you know, private dinners with the organizer of an event wouldn't be a widely attended gathering. But I think there's something important here that people often ask is, you know, can I do two WAG analyses? You know, is it possible that a conference or similar event qualifies as a WAG? But then maybe a dinner with a subset of attendees could also itself be a WAG. You know, is that something we can think about doing?
No, I think exactly, and I mean, I think there are times when that's precisely what you're going to have to do. Is you're going to have to treat related events as, I mean, even they might be related, but they may not be the exact same event, and so you might have to treat them as separate events and subject each of them to a widely attended gathering analysis. I don't think there's anything that says, as a matter of principle, or certainly not as a matter of the way that the regulation is structured, there's nothing per se that would prevent you from doing two separate WAG analyses for two events that were happening in proximity to each other but weren't necessarily the same event.
Yeah, and in certain industries this happens all the time. You might have the main industry conference, you know, an event taking place over a week, and some smaller subset, smaller organizations that are constituents of that industry might decide to have smaller meetings for sake of convenience. And it's okay for us to look at those separately.
One thing that I do want to point out here really heavily, and you know, we can talk about this in a lot more detail when we go through the invitations that we're going to talk about, and I certainly am going to talk about this in a lot of detail at the Advanced Practitioner Series this month, and that's the interplay between authorities like 1353, 31 U.S.C. 1353, which are like payments for travel and related expenses, and whether or not you can use WAG in conjunction with those. By large and in the main, you can't use WAG to accept free attendance at an event that the employee is attending in their official capacity while in travel status. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that because actually I want us to go to the next slide. Ryan, if you can take us to the next slide. Because this reaches to the second part of your the analysis here on page 1 of your worksheet, which is, are there other gifts that are being offered that are not under the auspices or under the guise of the definition of free attendance? And if that is the case, which would be things like travel expenses or lodgings or things like that, then you're probably going to have to look to see if, well, you will have to look to see if there's some other authority that would allow the employee to accept those offerings.
Yeah, absolutely, and this happens sometimes, and it's just important to remember that you can kind of look at these separately to do a different analysis. Multiple exceptions may apply in the same opinion.
Okay, can you take us to the next slide? And this is just to remind you, the next slide, which is the exception slide, and it just shows you, again, reminds you that 2635.204 has a multitude of exceptions. So if something doesn't fall within the ambit of free attendance, it might be something that another exception in the standards of conduct would cover. The next slide. The next slide shows us a bunch of other authorities under which certain things could be accepted. there are some, obviously there are some provisos about when and under what circumstance these authorities can be used. They're going to be limited by virtue of what's being offered. They're going to be limited by virtue of whether or not the employee is attending in an official capacity. They're going to be limited by the nature of the source of the payment. So each of these authorities is going to have its own limitations as well, but just be mindful that these are some common authorities that agencies do use to accept free attendance and other sorts of benefits.
Yeah, and I know I normally look to these authorities before going to WAG. If one of these applies, it's usually neater and tidier and better for the government to rely upon these specific statutory authorities than to use the regulatory authority under WAG. But if for some reason these don't work, you can then go to the WAG and do the analysis. But just because WAG deals with gifts of free attendance doesn't mean it's the only authority that can allow the acceptance of gifts of free attendance.
Right. And again, I think one thing that would be useful for people to look at to get a better sensibility about exactly where this WAG authority fits into this kind of universe of potential authorities that you could use. In the preamble to the final rule, when OGE published the final standards of conduct, and that's in 57 Federal Register 35006. Again, that's 57 Federal Register 35006, and it was published August 7th of 1992. In the preamble to the final rule, there's a very wonderful explanation about the genesis of this widely attended gathering exception, what its intention was, how the authority was meant to be used, and why it was created to begin with. And I think if you read that, you'll have a better sensibility about why the WAG is structured the way it is and how it was meant to be used.
I had an extremely difficult time understanding this authority before I read the section of the preamble. And after that, it made, I won't say complete sense, but it made a lot more sense. So I would encourage everyone to do that.
Yep, context is everything. Okay, so that's really your step one. So with the two invitations that we're going to give you, and we're going to turn our attention to the invitations after we've walked through this analysis sheet. But with both of the invitations that we've given you to work with, that's what your first step in your analysis is going to look like, is this whole gift identification. So if we go to the next slide, here we have step two. Now, step two is when we're kind of firmly placing ourselves within the widely attended gathering exception, and we're saying, okay, we know what's being offered is free attendance, so we know WAG is the right authority for us to be looking at.
We're going to move forward with that analysis.
Okay, so what are we looking at here now, Patrick?
So we want to know, is it widely attended, right? Because it has to be a gathering. We're talking about gifts of free attendance. But now we want to find out, what does it mean to be a widely attended gathering? What are the qualifying criteria that we need to satisfy in order to use this exception?
So if we go to 204 G2, there is a paragraph in there that discusses what type of event, generally speaking, is going to constitute a widely attended gathering. And we should say we use widely attended gathering in short change here. It's always a widely attended gathering of mutual interest to a number of parties. So that's really the full mouthful of what a widely attended gathering is there. So what are some of the things that we're supposed to think about or take a look at in terms of the size and type of the gathering?
So there are a number of things we want to consider, but I think one of the most important things is the opportunity for an exchange of ideas. And if you look at that diagram where we discuss widely attended gatherings and what kinds of events are structured such that the exception might apply, we spend a lot of time talking about structured so that there was an opportunity for an exchange of ideas.
And you will not find, is there an opportunity for the exchange of ideas anywhere in the language of this widely attended gathering exception. So again, this kind of further bolsters why it's really important for you to read that advisory to get a sensibility about things like this that are not going to be in the reg itself. But where do we get that? I mean, what is it in the reg that kind of has led us to this conclusion that really what we're looking for is the event has to provide an opportunity for the exchange of ideas, Patrick?
Well, we talk about a large number of persons who will be in attendance, and that those persons have a diversity of views or interests. For example, if it's open to members from throughout an industry or profession. And we need a range of opinions. So what I've always understood is that something like a company picnic put on by a prohibited source probably isn't going to qualify because we don't have a diversity of views. You know, everyone works for the same company; they have a similar view. So we need diversity in the attendees. So, but all those folks could be in an industry as long as they're not all from the same company or the same firm or the same entity.
Right, and why would we care about people's points of view if they weren't going to have an opportunity to express them, or there was not going to be an opportunity for the exchange of ideas? So I think that's part of where this aspect of our interpretation is coming from, which is the way that we described the need for a diversity of viewpoints and a large group of people to be present lends itself to the notion that the reason for that is because it's expected that there's going to be some colloquy, there's going to be some degree of conversation.
And yeah, and I think in that conversation it's important that there's a diversity, because one of the things we're concerned about is sort of the appearances of exclusive access.
Right.
So that people aren't providing free attendance so that they can, you know, cajole or otherwise try and influence government officials to a particular point of view. But where we have a diversity of interests, you know, we have a more discursive environment, a diversity of views being served. So it's not the case that the government is allowing itself to listen only to one party, or is being you know, compensated with the gift of free attendance only for listening to one party to a particular controversy or issue. Exactly.
So it's a matter of access. It's a matter of making sure that there is, as you said, exclusivity of access. And on the next slide, basically all we've done, again, is to try to highlight for you the portion of the widely attended gathering definition that reaches to this kind of what makes something, in the regulation, what makes something a widely attended gathering. So let's go on then to step 3, which is on the next page then. Or actually, no, it's on page 2. It's still on page 2 of your worksheet. This is step 3, determination of agency interest. So what is the determination of agency interest, Patrick, and why is it necessary, do you think?
Well, we start here, and I've always found this to be strange. This is the part I didn't understand until I read the preamble. So when we look at G2, it says, when there has been a determination that his attendance is in the interest of the agency because it will further agency programs and operations, an employee may accept an unsolicited gift of free attendance. That always struck me as very strange, because we know when we're looking at subpart B, the employee is accepting the gift personally. This isn't a gift to the government. However, we need a determination of agency interest, and it is in the agency's interest if the attendance will further programs and operations. So that's very interesting, and I think this is one of the more challenging parts for ethics officials.
Yeah, I think so. And again, this is where, if you read the preamble, I think it will help inform your understanding of the WAG determination, because one of the reasons, as you will read there, is one of the reasons that the WAG exception was created was because not every agency or not every agency necessarily has agency statutory gift acceptance authority. So absent that sort of authority, if an agency had been offered, one of their employees had been offered free attendance at an event that the agency wanted them to attend, you know, if the agency had gift acceptance authority, it could go ahead and accept that free attendance under its agency gift acceptance authority and allow the person to attend. For agencies that don't have that gift authority, there would be no authority to allow agencies to accept that kind of offer, even though the event might be, you know, eminently useful to the agency. So unless the agency paid the employee's way, there was no authority to allow for the free acceptance.
And there's also no authority for the employee to accept that gift either. So it may be of interest to both the agency and the employee, maybe to attend a meeting of a professional organization, you know, something similar to that. And without this exception, that employee would have no means to go, no means to attend, to enrich themselves professionally and to further agency operations.
Indeed. So in this instance, we couldn't create an agency gift acceptance authority because OGE doesn't have that authority. That rests with Congress, not with the U.S. Office of Government Ethics. But we could create an employee ability to accept the gift personally. But again, the only way that the employee could do that is if they're not there on official time as part of their official duties. But the idea being, the sensibility was to create an authority that was basically furthering agencies' interests, you know, and allowing agencies to send their people to things that it was in their interest for them to attend, notwithstanding that there was no gift acceptance authority for the agency to accept it. So this agency determination of agency interest is really kind of being borrowed from the notion that if agencies had agency gift acceptance, they could be accepting these invitations under that authority. So we would like there to be that present when the employee is being sent and being allowed to accept.
And I think it's important to remember here the function that exceptions play in the gifts rules. We have the general prohibition and the exceptions may be invoked. In this case, we provide specific criteria about when it's appropriate to invoke the widely attended gathering exception. And we also provide some administrative guidance about how to actually affect that. If we go on here, it says, employees must be on leave when they accept the gift. So the employee is accepting the gift personally. But when we decide whether or not it's appropriate for the employee to invoke the exception, there needs to be this determination of agency interest.
Exactly. On the next slide, we kind of show you, again, we show you where in the regulation you can find these definitions. There's a little bit of it in G2. There's a more expansive determination of agency interest in G3. So I recommend that you read G3 as well so that you can get a sensibility about kind of like the various things that should be considered. If we could go to the next slide then, too. Just a few things for you to be mindful of when you're making the agency interest determination is that this is something that the agency designee is supposed to be doing, and the agency designee doesn't have to be the agency ethics official.
That's true.
Correct, Patrick?
Yes. The delegation can come down through the DAEO, to any appropriate official. I find, in my experience, it's almost universally going to be an ethics official, or at least someone with some ethics responsibilities. But it's not unheard of for this to be an authority that rests with an individual who doesn't have any other ethics responsibilities.
Well, I can tell you right now, as a matter of practice here at OGE, anytime I have an employee come to me with a request for a widely attended gathering determination, I immediately go to their supervisor and ask them to let me know what, in their opinion, the agency's interest is in the employee's attendance at the event, because I'm not really in a position necessarily to make that determination. So I would at least like that kind of input to see, because maybe there are things that I couldn't possibly consider because I'm not familiar with what that particular part of the agency is doing or why this particular event would be of interest to them.
And for those of you who might not know, Cheryl, in addition to being a lead instructor, is also our designated agency ethics official.
Yes.
So we all have many hats here at OGE.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. There can be either an oral or written determination, depending upon whether or not the person who's being invited has duties that could substantially affect the interests of the person who's inviting them. And again, you want to be able to make these threshold determinations about, is this actually going to further agency programs and operations? So again, this is a threshold determination that you really should be making before, sort of just jumping in and concluding that because the event itself seems to qualify, that then the determination just kind of trails that it, because you don't want the tail sort of wagging the dog.
No,
here.
that's really important. What is the agency's interest? What programs or operations will be furthered? And I think that's a balancing test that we're going to do, and determining how strong the agency's interest is goes a long way to helping with the rest of the analysis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? This slide, we've just tried to give you a few indicators of things that you might want to consider in terms of what constitutes agency interest. We're not saying this is the be-all and end-all. This is just to give you some sensibilities about the types of things we know agencies take into consideration for determination of agency interest. The next slide, please, Ryan. So step 4, which if you go to the next page in your WAG analysis worksheet as well, this is where we get into this whole notion of what constitutes a sponsor of the event, because why do we care about who the sponsor of the event is, Patrick?
We have some special criteria that we have to apply in a rather complicated way in the event that the gift of free attendance is being offered by someone other than the sponsor of the event. So this would be like, if we had an event where other companies or organizations could buy a table at the event, and the person who purchased the table was extending the event. That would be a gift from a non-sponsor. We have these additional criteria that are more stringent than when the gift is being offered by the sponsor.
And we will talk at a lot more depth about what constitutes sponsorship as opposed to non-sponsorship for purposes of this definition. But it's just important for you to understand that we do care whether or not the person who's extending the invitation and bearing the cost of the employee's attendance is actually what we would call, I use the word host, I think, because I think host is more what we mean
and also
than
more
sponsor.
consistent with the standard English understanding of these words.
Absolutely, yes. I think the better nomenclature here is definitely if the cost is being provided by the host or if it's being provided by someone other than the host of the event. And then there are special criteria. There's a number of people that have to be in attendance, and the dollar value matters when it's a non-sponsor who's providing the cost.
Our worksheet helps with that analysis.
Exactly.
But something definitely to keep in mind.
Exactly. Okay. The next slide is just showing you where it is in the regulation. So if we could move on to the next slide, which is step 5. And here's where we're going to ask you to do something of a conflict analysis with respect to the employee, right, Patrick?
That's right.
And why? So we're looking at specifically what? We're looking at the
relationship between the offerer of the gift and the employee and their position at the agency. We want to see if there are any recusals in place that could help mitigate any conflicts of interest. And then this is where we balance the agency's interests against any potential appearance concerns.
Right.
Right. The acceptance of gifts and gratuities, sort of creates almost all the time some sort of appearance issue that we need to be mindful of. And this is where we make a determination about whether or not the agency's interests outweigh any potential appearance concerns or any potential material conflict.
Right, and here's where when we get into the exercises, you're going to want to consider who the employee is who's being invited. And when you're doing your own analyses, if you have multiple employees that have been invited to the same event, you really, for the most part, shouldn't be doing a single determination unless you can ascertain that it's like employees who are being invited, and so the analysis for one is really tantamount to the analysis for all. But
that doesn't always happen.
It doesn't always happen.
There
so
are
you
lots
want
of
to be
other
really
ways
careful.
that this can come up. You can have an employee for whom the likelihood of potential conflict or appearance concern is almost nil.
Right.
And you can have an employee for whom the acceptance of that gift could be extremely problematic.
Exactly.
So it's situational.
It is very situational. Okay, so the next slide for that, basically, again, we're just showing you where we talk about the conflict analysis. So if we go to step 6, which is on the next page, I believe, of your WAG analysis worksheet. Here we're going to talk about spouse and other guests. And this is really just kind of a pretty straightforward provision, which basically just says when and under what circumstance a spouse or a guest, where the employee can accept an invitation for for either a spouse or another guest to the same event to which they've been invited.
Yeah.
And there are provisions in the regulation that speak specifically to that, which is at G6 is where that is discussed in the regulation.
I find this is a case where it's just important to remember that this provision exists.
Yes.
If you get an invitation that includes an invitation to a spouse or guest, to remember that there's specific guidance in the reg.
Exactly. So if we can go to the next slide then, Ryan. We can talk about this a little bit more when we debrief the exercise. This is just kind of a gentle reminder that because the WAG is a gift to the employee, for those of your employees who file public financial disclosure reports, there may be a requirement for them to report the widely attended gathering, this gift, if it meets the reporting thresholds. And we can talk about that more on Thursday.
And just a little hint here. When I was working in an agency, I found this the strongest argument for having written WAG determinations, because we put that in the folder, and then when we got the 450 and saw this gift, we'd say, "Oh no, have we seen that gift before?" And it's like, "Oh, here's the opinion that we drafted." The panic subsides much more quickly when you can readily put your hands on that opinion.
Exactly. Okay, and so for the final slide, just so that you guys know that's a list of different resources that you may want to avail yourself of when you're doing these determinations. We've included the DAEOgrams, the legal advisories, that some of which we referred to. And the lobbyist gift ban is something that you're going to want to consider if you have appointees who are
because they don't get to use the WAG.
Because they don't get to use the WAG
If you're
exception.
subject to the lobbyist gift ban, there is no WAG analysis for those employees.
Exactly.
So that's another place we could save yourself a lot of time. Find out your employees subject to the lobbyist gift ban, and then there's no WAG analysis to do because it's not available.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so that's it for the slide deck. I just wanted to briefly just call your attention to the two invitations that we gave you. One is is for an economist, and this is an invitation to a luncheon that's honoring President Hu Jintao. And it's the invitation. It was an actual invitation. Agencies did actually get invitations like this. But what we would ask you to do, or what the theory is behind this invitation in this particular exercise, is we've given you a cover letter, which is the actual invitation from the organization. We've given you a position description. So in this particular case, it is an economist who has been invited to this particular event. If that doesn't work for you because you don't have economists in your organization and you want in your own mind to be thinking more along the lines of who in my organization would be tantamount to,
right,
or who would likely be invited to an event like this to do this analysis, we're not going to hold you strictly,
No, there's nothing special about the hypothetical employees that we're going to use for our purposes in debriefing. So if you want to consider your own circumstances because that's better practice for you, all the better, I think.
Exactly. I mean, because you're the one who would be having to make an agency determination based on your agency, not on some hypothetical agency. So, so again, we provide that if you think it would be useful for you. If it's not, and you need to do your own thing, please feel free to do your own thing. But what we're going to ask you to do with this invitation is to fill out one of the widely attended gathering worksheets, go through each of the steps that we just outlined, to arrive at your final determination about whether or not the widely attended gathering could be used in this instance.
Yeah, and in terms of learning objectives, the goal is to practice using the process.
Yes.
Because there isn't one determination. We can't determine that this is or is not a widely attended gathering. What we're going to determine is that this meets certain criteria and that we have the flexibility to make a determination of agency interest for a given employee. But the answer to the question of can an employee accept this differs from invitation to invitation, and it differs from employee to employee.
And it differs from agency to agency. And I think that's one of the biggest things is that, agencies differ in mission and function. And one of the things that we hear all the time is you have employees who say, well, I heard from my friend at EPA that they're being allowed to go. And the issue is, well, you don't work for EPA, you work for, Jump.
Right.
And it might be completely appropriate for an EPA employee to attend this event, but our mission and our function in our agency is not that of EPA.
Yeah, and I think this is really important because there are similar rules that apply to employees of the legislative and judicial branches, and they even sometimes use similar language. So you might have an employee come to you, and the invitation itself says this is a widely attended gathering. Well, it's not a widely attended gathering. You, as the agency ethics official or designee, get to make the determination as to whether or not there's an agency interest that outweighs appearance concerns. And that's a necessary determination in order for an employee to accept the gift. So, the fact that the host of the event or the sponsor of the event or whoever put together the invitations writes the words widely attended gathering
and
on the invitation
you will see that.
does not make it so.
Exactly. So don't allow yourself to feel cowed or pressured by either the invitee who is trying to insist that they've already made the determination for you, or from employees who justifiably may want to attend something and you're not necessarily seeing the winning argument for why it's in the agency's interest for them to attend.
Yeah, and I think these are things that change over time as well. Making a determination of agency interest can change over time. If you're in the middle of some very sensitive work that affects key stakeholders, you may be more conservative in your determinations of agency interest. It may value the avoidance of any appearance concerns more greatly than you would at different times in the agency's history.
Exactly, and those are all the sensibilities we expect you to bring to your determination every time an invitation is brought before you. So just very quickly then to just alert you then to the second invitation, which is the Women's Policy Incorporated Congressional Gala. Again, we've suggested that the invitation is going to your legislative affairs specialist. And again, at the bottom, in teeny tiny script at the bottom, we give you this position description about we suggest that it's your director for legislative and intergovernmental affairs. Again, if that works for you and is useful for you to use that person as the point of departure for this analysis, great. If not, and you've got a better person you want to be thinking about that this invitation might be extended to do your analysis, again, use the worksheet and bring your own sensibility to that determination.
And that's really good because, even if we wanted to, Cheryl and I can't teach you how to make a determination of
Exactly.
interest for your agency. So that's always going to be your determination. All we can do is point you in the direction of critical pieces of information you should take into account when making those determinations.
Exactly. Exactly. If you have any final comments, Patrick, otherwise I think we should open it up and ask for any questions. Do we have any folks on the phone line who have any questions for us?
Thank you. At this time, for any phone questions, press *1, please. Please unmute your line and record your name to be introduced. Again, for any questions over the phone lines, press *1. If you'd like to withdraw the request at any time, you may press *2. Thank you. One moment for the phone questions. Thank you. And from the phone lines, we're currently showing no questions.
Great.
Okay.
Well, it sounds like everyone is ready to go and get started on the exercises. And we would really encourage you in the next 48 hours or so, do take some time at least to get familiar with the invitations and take a crack at filling out a couple of the worksheets. It's good practice to see where you are with respect to the process. If you get stuck somewhere, that's okay. We're going to have 2 hours to talk about the process on Thursday, and hopefully we'll clarify any issues that you might have. But running into those problems, running into those areas of confusion before we get to that session will be very helpful to get the most that you can out of the class.
I mean, I agree. I think that unless or until you make yourself go through the worksheet and do the determination in that step-by-step methodical kind of way, it really will help you identify any points of confusion, any things that maybe you didn't realize you were supposed to be, determining as part of your widely attended gathering determination. I think you're going to find the debrief much more meaningful. We certainly are going to be available to answer any questions you have. Things that you've encountered while you were filling out the worksheets, things that don't make sense in light of the explanation that we provide in the debrief. So really, to get the most out of this debrief on Thursday, really take a crack at both of these invitations because they're different. They have different learning points.
Yes.
We chose them for a reason. So, and it'll be interesting to see if you can see the little hiccups that we.
The other thing I'd like to do here, I noticed a number of you are registered with colleagues from the same agency.
Yes.
If you're in geographic proximity or you have other means to collaborate on these exercises, I found within ethics offices it's really interesting when folks get together and discuss particularly WAGs, and particularly the part where we make determinations about agency interest. You may find incredible consistency across your organization, or you may find some important differences. And talking through those can be very useful, one, for the consistency of advice coming out of your shop. It can also be very useful to get some insight into how people are measuring agency interest.
So we encourage you not only to do it individually, collectively, and we will see you back here on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Cheryl. It's been really fun.
Well, thanks, Patrick, very much. And thank you, Ryan, for running the shop behind the scenes there.
We'll see you guys on Thursday.
We'll see you on Thursday.